Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh.
When we
all get to heaven.
All right, so let's start reading in verse 15. I'm not sure if there's any natural breaks in this section going to the end of the chapter, so I'm likely to read all the way through to the end of the chapter. But verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulian, and it called Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. And he said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with its two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men in the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. All right. The first thing that we want to note, I think that's of some significance in this section of Scripture, is we are introduced to a character that has never been named before, and that is Gabriel. Gabriel is sent to explain the vision. Who is Gabriel? He's a messenger of God, an archangel. Arch just simply being a designation of authority. So an angel of the Lord is sent to explain this vision to Daniel. The vision refers to the time of the end, it says. The time of the end of what? Does it tell us specifically? It does not tell us specifically, other than it does set some time parameters, right? What events are described? Well, the Medo-Persian Empire falling to Greece, and the great king of Greece falling, and it being divided into 4 kingdoms, and then one arising from within those 4 kingdoms that exerts great power, but who is destroyed. And it's very specifically said, not by human hands. So this is someone who falls not to a person or a foreign nation, but he falls because of what? God. Anytime we read that phrase, not by human hands, is simply an expression to make sure that we realize that that means God is acting, not human being. It's not the will of man, it's the will of God. This is not the end of all history. It is the appointed end of the oppression which is described. And that oppression being, he makes it clear, this little horn that rises is going to just exert great power, destructive in nature, suppressive in nature. Evil is going to reign. Deceit is going to reign, all by his approval. All of those things are going to come to an end. How they're going to come to an end, that's actually the important part of this. Again, he doesn't go into a great amount of detail about the mechanism other than to say to us what? Yeah, it's not by human hands. God is going to bring this to an end. And I do believe that that is the primary thing that we need to understand. A lot of times, well, I'll hold that comment back for a moment and we'll get into it later. What does it say about Daniel's reaction to this event? So he's had the vision, and now he has this conversation with an angel, because it says, I sought to understand it. That's where he starts. I've had this vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks calling Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he wants to understand it, but what does this reading tell us is Daniel's reaction? Okay, he becomes ill. That's the first thing. For days, some number of days, and he doesn't understand it. Now, what this does is it illustrates the weight of this prophetic vision that he's just had on him and on his person. There's a common expression. Used to hear it a lot more when I was a kid than I do now, probably because I needed to hear it a lot more then than I do now. But you're going to worry yourself sick. My mother, my grandmother, other people like that you're going to worry yourself sick. What do they mean by that? That's exactly right. When we are burdened under stress and anxiety and concern and worry, it can actually have a physiological effect on us. I think that's what's being described here. Daniel was so consumed with these things, concerned about these things, trying to understand these things, and even with Gabriel's information, he's still not sure. Gabriel says 2 things that are interesting here, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of my notes. Gabriel says 2 things that are interesting here. First, he says, this is not for now. In other words, these things are not being described that are talking about what's happening now. The Medes and the Persians hadn't arisen yet, and Greece certainly hadn't arisen yet. And so that's the first thing. Daniel, don't worry about this because This isn't describing the terrible events that you're going through. It's describing yet things in the future. And then he says something else that I found really interesting. What's he tell him to do with the information? Seal up the vision. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, put it away for later. Don't publish it. It's not Daniel's job now to take this and go out and tell the people about it. In fact, I would argue that God revealed it to him for a completely different reason. So that this book could be written. And who's to benefit from the knowledge of this vision because of this book? Down the stream of time, for the things that would take place under the new covenant, to help prepare and make people aware of the authority of God, the involvement of God, that God was at work to save, that even through all of these terrible events that look terrible, God was still at work to deliver mankind, and it happened exactly the way that he said that it would happen, and exactly when that he said that it would happen, so that we know that we can have confidence in what? God's promises. There are promises that have yet to be fulfilled, even today. What's the biggest one? Okay, the return of the Lord. And connected to that, okay, before judgment and after the return of the Lord, the resurrection. There's been a promised resurrection. Hadn't happened for any of us. How do we know it's going to happen? Because he has this kind of authority. And he has this kind of knowledge, and he's able to look down the stream of time, and he does know the end from the beginning, and he can tell us what's going to happen. And if it's his will, regardless of what's going on in the world, what's going to happen? His will be done. And so we can have confidence in his promises. And 1 Corinthians 15 makes that particular promise extremely important in terms of how we live our lives. We're not pitiable individuals that hope in nothing, and we don't hope in this life only, but we hope in the resurrection. And there's also the aspect of this promise being affirmation that Jesus was who he said he was, which again was proved with power how? By his resurrection. But we're told in both the book of Romans and the book of 1 Corinthians that these things were recorded for our learning. And that's what he's saying here. Seal this up. This isn't for you guys. This is stuff that's going to happen This is for the benefit of those who come after us. Not after us, but after Daniel. Yes, sir.
Sealed it up, but he's given the express command not to write down, which is not what we see in Daniel. We see that he's allowed to write down. He's told to seal it away, put it away.
And anytime God says to seal something up, he also at some point does what? Opens it, tells him to publish it. Has he done that? Yes. He's actually instructed us to do what? To go and proclaim these things to all people everywhere. So the time for publication is now, as long as it's called today. And so we got to keep that in mind. And the value of knowing that is extremely important, because it also tells me how important it is for me to speak about these things, to tell people about God, to tell people what he's done, to tell people who are worried and concerned about world affairs that they need not be concerned needlessly, that God is in control, and that even when extremely powerful rulers who dominate and who are evil are out there, at the proper time, what's going to happen? Their fall. And who will make certain that it happens? God. And so, again, up to this point, what we're seeing over and over and over again are proofs that God rules in the affairs of men. Understanding God's sovereignty can be overwhelming, but ultimately it should strengthen our faith. Is God dependent upon me to solve all the world's problems? No, and that's a good thing, because if the world depended upon me to solve all of its problems, we would be in desperate trouble. Luckily, that's not the case. Even when evil seems to triumph, believers know what? There is an appointed end to it. And that is sure. That is completely the point of the book of Revelation. The entirety of the point of the book of Revelation is so that we understand that no matter how bad it gets, how terrible it looks, how much it looks like evil is winning out over good, there is an appointed time of an end, and who wins? Good. God reigns. On the backside of this, God wins. Living life is kind of like watching a football game that we already know the score of. We already know how the thing turns out. What we're actually watching is the process to get it there. And that changes the nature of watching. Anybody think it's more fun to watch a game when you don't know what's going to happen? Yeah. Why? Or are we going to make it a movie? Watch a movie. I got to tell this story. I have to. I've told it to a few people outside of teaching. But you remember the movie Titanic? That was like, what, 96, 97, sometime in that neighborhood. Micah was a baby. We were preaching, I was preaching, it was actually me and Jack Holt were preaching in Lindale, Texas together. And there was a group of teenage girls. We had a big group of high school age kids at Lindale. And a big group of teenage girls were talking one evening and all excited about going to see Titanic. And my wife was like, well, you know how it ends. And they were like, what? Well, the ship sinks. And they were completely blown away and actually upset that she spoiled the movie for them. It's different. It's less anxious and worried. There's less drama when you're watching something and you already know what's going to happen. That is exactly how we should live, and exactly why we live differently than people who don't know what God has revealed. We don't live like those who have no hope. Isn't that what Paul wrote by inspiration to the church at Thessalonica? We know what is going to happen. We know what is in store. We know who's in control. We know who wins. We know that even if we die, that doesn't mean we lose. What does that mean? It means we win. It means that we're just that much closer to the resurrection, to the transformation, and going to be with the Lord. So we don't have to worry about it. And we don't have to worry about those who have fallen. They're not ahead of us any, but they're not behind us either. And it is as sure as we are standing here breathing air right now that these things will come to pass because we have seen over and over and over again these demonstrations by God, so that we know that His word is true and we can have faith in it. Anybody know what the word faith means? Anybody want to take a stab at what the word faith means? All right, that is a direct quote out of the Bible. It does provide evidence of things that we can't see. But why is it evidence? What do most people believe faith is? Let me ask it that way. Maybe you'll be more comfortable answering that question. What do people in the world think about faith? Okay, blind, and I would use a different word, but blind I would use, but blind acceptance, blind belief. That's what they think faith is when you believe something without evidence. That's the way you hear it expressed over and well, let's believe it. But God has not left us to believe things without evidence, and that's not what faith is. Faith is actually conviction. Faith means that you are certain of things, that you have a certain belief in God, although you haven't seen Him, that you have a certain belief in the resurrection, although it's never happened before your eyes, that you have a certain belief in heaven. How many of you have been to heaven? Where's it at? What does it look like? We can't answer any of those questions. How many of you believe that heaven is there? And that one day you'll be there? See, there's conviction of things not seen. It's not a matter of doing it, though, without evidence. This is the evidence. Absolutely. And how many of those jurors saw the events with their own eyes? But was their conclusion based on evidence? Yes. It's the same principle. They came to a conclusion based upon the testimony that was given. And by the way, we need to make clear about this as well. Not all of the evidence that's presented in a court is photographic or physical, or a lot of the evidence. In fact, I would argue that most of the evidence that's presented in court is what? Testimony. Which is exactly what this is. A record of testimony in which we draw conclusions about things that we are not present to see. That doesn't mean that we're drawing these conclusions baselessly or without evidence. It simply means that we weren't there. None of us saw Jesus ascend into heaven. But what we do have is the testimony of the men who did see it. And then you got to ask yourself the question when you read that testimony, are they believable? Is there reason to trust what they have to say? Were they actually alive when they claimed to be alive? Were they actually in the place that they claimed to be? Does the testimony ring true? All of the same things that we do in the courtroom when a witness stands up there and talks. We listen and we decide whether or not they are reliable. And we're helped along in that journey, by the way, by the advocates on either side who are either providing reasons to have confidence in what they have to say or raising questions. And then you decide, okay, was this person there? Did this person see something? And is their description of what they saw consistent with what we know otherwise? And if the answers to those questions are yes, then you have a reliable, believable witness, which becomes the basis upon drawing conclusions. That is exactly what the Bible is. But if we don't take the time to hear the testimony, then can we draw a valid conclusion? Now, I'm glad you brought up the court system, because there's a lot of parallels in the court system and what we're talking about here. This is very important, extremely important. In the court system, if I come up and say to you, well, I don't know what Greg said, I wasn't there, but I was told that Greg said, what would be the case of my testimony? It would be worthless. That's hearsay. This is important, because I don't want anybody to have faith in God based upon what I say the Bible says. What I say that Paul wrote, what I say that John wrote, what I say that Peter wrote. I want you to go back and do what? Reference their testimony. I'm going to say this is what I believe to be true based upon this testimony, and this is where we get into a slightly different illustration, and we're going to make this a college setting, and this is now a paper that I'm writing. And I am saying this is what I believe is true, and I believe it's true because this person says this, and this person found that, and this person identified that. You don't take my paper and say, oh, okay, it's true. What do? You go back to the sources that I cite and see if they say the things that I say that they said. AI does, in fact, make up sources sometimes. There's some lawyers that have gotten themselves in trouble because they have submitted briefs to judges with court cases that were completely made up by AI that they got to write their brief for them. And I'm going to tell you right now, judges don't like that. So we have to understand that this is why we get places like Acts 17 that talks about the noble-mindedness of those in Thessalonica, because they didn't just receive the word. What did they do? They went back and searched the scriptures to see if it was so. So when Paul preached to them and talked to them about what the prophets had said, they didn't just go, oh, okay. They went back and read the prophets and found that, in fact, the prophets did say, and the conclusions that were drawn were consistent with the testimony of the prophet. And so now I have reason to have confidence in the conclusion. And there's a lot of this. God said this. This is what happened. Laying the foundation for what? This is what will be. And therefore we should have reliable confidence that, in fact, what will be will come about. Primarily what's left to will be is that we will endure persecution and we will die, but we will be raised and we will be changed and we will go to be with him. And so Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. If I didn't go to prepare a place for you, would I say that I go and prepare a place for you? And we have reason to live in confidence that that promise is true, because every other time that God has promised that he would do something or that something would come to pass, that's what happened. Right. And then I need to live by faith, by conviction. Need to live like I actually believe that these things are certain. which again is why you have the boldness of the apostles, not fearing what man might do to them. Because, as Abraham apparently speculated pertaining to his son, if necessary, God would raise him from the dead in order to accomplish what he promised would happen through him. If I kill Isaac before he's married and has children, I'm not real sure how he can be the father of a great nation. But God said it was going to happen, so I know it's going to happen. So if God has to raise him from the dead so it can happen, then that's what's going to happen. That's the argument that we find out that Abraham made in his own mind from Hebrews 11. We're not told that at the time in the Genesis account, but when Hebrews 11 talks about those events, that's exactly what it says. That he considered that God was able to raise him from the dead. That is living with confidence that the promise that you've received is going to turn out exactly as God has said. One of the places that I always go to talk about this and teach this is Acts 27, and that ship travel that the Apostle Paul is on, where this terrible storm arises. It lasts for over 14 days. They're throwing the ship's tackle overboard. They're throwing all the food overboard. They're trying to make the ship as light as possible because they're terrified that it's going to capsize and sink in the storm. And God tells Paul, don't worry about it. Everybody's going to live. If you stay on the boat, everybody's going to live. And then Paul makes that great speech. Take some food, guys. Relax. The ship is going to wreck. It's going to be a complete loss, but none of us will lose our lives because God told me, and it will turn out exactly as he has said. And he put his confidence in that and lived based on that. In fact, we see how strongly he lived based on that and how much influence he had with others regarding that, because there were some men who were like, let's get the lifeboat and get out of here. And they prevented them from doing it and then cut the boats away so that that couldn't happen, because God had said, stay on the ship, and if everybody stays on the ship, you'll be delivered. Okay, everybody's going to stay on the ship, whether you want to or not. Because I believe God that it will turn out exactly as he has said. And what happened? Well, the ship was lost and broken up on the rocks. But what happened to them? They survived. Exactly as God has said. And so Paul would carry that with him. And when he faced death later in life, what did he say? That he had no fear. For I know whom I believed and am persuaded that he's able to keep what I've entrusted to him against that day. This is foundational reason for us to have that kind of confidence in God and what he has said and the promises that he has made. We need to live with that same assurance. History moves toward divine fulfillment under the Prince of Princes. What's he also called besides the Prince of Princes? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The supreme authority. God's sovereignty over empires. Any empire that exists in the world exists by whose authority? God's. Romans 13. What if they're bad people? Well, the Babylonians were not good people, but we're clearly told in Daniel that they existed and reigned because God allowed them to exist and reign until he was through with them. And then what did he do? He had them replaced by the Medes and the Persians. Were the Medes and the Persians good people? Not completely, no. They're kind of rough and not godly and didn't worship God. And they existed for exactly how long? Exactly as long as they were useful for God's plan and purpose. And then what happened? Greece came along. Was Alexander the Great a wonderful, nice, God-fearing man? No, but God allowed him to reign and allowed him to have power and to exercise that power over the world. By the way, he was actually setting the stage for something extremely important, because with the growth and the power that Greece had in all directions of the earth, what happened? Well, everything was prepared for the gospel to be written, because every nation began to speak a common language and could communicate freely between one another within the scope of that language. And that's the language that God used to do what? But before, now what we're dealing with is the intertestamental period, right? The 400 years in between the last prophecy and the arrival of Christ. This all happens. What happens to the Old Testament scriptures themselves? They get translated into Greek, which then can be preached and shared with the Greek-speaking world, so that when Christ arises, they can recognize him too. Up until that time, those people had no knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures. But now the Hebrew scriptures are available to them in their language, and they studied them. And so when the preachers go out, and Paul eventually goes to the Gentiles and begins to speak these things, everything that he's saying is not completely foreign to them. Those that were educated among them read the Hebrew scriptures. And so Paul could talk about what the prophet said. And they would say, I remember reading that back in the 8th grade. Miss Becca taught me that. I don't think she teaches 8th grade. What do you teach? I mean, just think about the providence that went into all this. We got Rome that rises to power, who built roads and reached into the corners of the earth that had yet not been touched. The Eastern Roman Empire goes all the way up into northern Europe, beyond England and all up into the Nordic countries. Now, they very quickly withdrew and didn't do well up there, but that's another story. The roads were built, which allowed what to happen? For there to be free travel throughout the world. For the disciples who were told to go into all the world and preach the gospel. They had a way to get there. A sort of safe way to get there. So keep all that in mind. There's some faithfulness and oppression things here. There's some foreshadowing about an ultimate deliverer that is set forth in this vision. That's talking about Christ. That's messianic in nature. There's going to be this one that ultimately comes. And therefore there is this enduring hope for all believers. The Lord wills, next time we'll look at Daniel 9. He's offers a prayer, and then there's a prophecy about the 70 weeks that we'll talk about a little bit in that chapter. Anybody have any questions before we dismiss? All right, I appreciate your attention and your participation.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the